June 5th, 1944. The wind over the Normandy coast carried the scent of rain and seaweed, sweeping across barbed wire and steel obstacles buried in sand. Inside the concrete casemates of the Atlantic Wall, soldiers of the German 352nd Infantry Division prepared for another night of routine watch. They were young, most in their early 20s, and veterans of no more than a few campaigns. The invasion everyone had spoken about for months was expected, yet no one believed it would come now, under heavy clouds and high tides. In one of those bunkers near Colleville-sur-Mer, a soldier wrote a letter to his wife. The handwriting was precise, the tone practical. He described the cold of the bunker, the dampness of uniforms, the monotony of rations. He mentioned that gulls had been circling the shoreline since morning, as if sensing something. "The sea feels different tonight," he wrote. "It has a strange calm." Above him, the German coastal defense network, a labyrinth of command posts, radar stations, and telephone lines, functioned like a great machine of anticipation, but cracks ran through it everywhere. Some radar units were down for maintenance, ammunition deliveries delayed, and communication between divisions inconsistent. The Atlantic Wall, heralded in propaganda as impregnable, was in truth a collection of isolated strong points. At the sector defended by the 352nd Division, orders were simple: maintain readiness, hold the line, and await confirmation of enemy movement. The division's commander, General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, had repositioned his units inland, believing that the Allies would not strike directly at Omaha Beach. The result was a front line thinner than it appeared on any map. That night, as darkness spread over the coast, Allied aircraft passed overhead, first in singles, then in hundreds. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, their tracers vanishing into the clouds. The men inside the bunkers listened to the distant explosions and assumed the Allies were bombing ports again, as they had so many times before. No one realized that hundreds of paratroopers were already descending into Normandy, scattering across hedgerows and villages in the first phase of Operation Overlord. At 23:45, the letter was sealed. The soldier placed it inside his pack to be sent on the next mail convoy north. His last words read, "Whatever comes, I trust the sea will tell us first." He was right. Within hours, the sea would reveal everything, not with calm, but with fire. Shortly after midnight, confusion began spreading through the German defensive network along the Normandy coastline. Reports arrived from radar stations near Cherbourg and Caen of unusually heavy air traffic over the channel. Some messages mentioned parachutes spotted inland. Others described explosions far from the beaches. To most officers, it sounded like another Allied deception, something to keep their attention away from the Pas-de-Calais sector, where German intelligence still believed the real invasion would come. Inside the positions of the 352nd Infantry Division, routine continued. Patrols checked beach obstacles, engineers inspected mines, and sentries reported nothing unusual at sea. The men were used to false alarms. Dozens had come and gone in the past weeks, triggered by Allied reconnaissance flights or small naval skirmishes. Yet something felt different this time. At 1 o'clock, several soldiers noted distant flashes over the water. Not lightning, but rhythmic bursts. Within an hour, the entire western horizon began to flicker faintly, as if illuminated by a storm just beyond sight. No one could identify it. Radios carried fragments of communication, static-filled and incomplete. The coastal defense system, designed for precision, now suffered from its greatest flaw: dependence on perfect coordination. One damaged cable or jammed frequency could isolate entire sectors. By 2 o'clock, reports from forward observers indicated that aircraft were dropping objects into the sea, perhaps mines, perhaps something else. Allied deception units were, in fact, releasing radar-reflecting strips to simulate invasion fleets. The illusion worked. Several German batteries opened fire on empty water, burning ammunition that would not be replaced. At 3:30, the first real clues appeared. Naval lookouts from Le Havre to Carentan sent word of faint engine noises, hundreds of them. Still, higher command dismissed the possibility of a landing. Field Marshal Rommel, who had argued that any invasion must be destroyed at the waterline, was in Germany for his wife's birthday. His absence left coastal defense decisions in the hands of officers too cautious to act without approval. Requests for tank reinforcements were delayed, awaiting confirmation from Berlin. Meanwhile, the men in their bunkers began to feel tremors beneath the concrete as distant artillery fire echoed across the sea. Some thought it was a drill. Others believed it was the beginning. No orders came. The system waited for certainty while the enemy moved with momentum. Inside the same casemate where the letter had been written, one of the soldiers remarked that the air smelled different, metallic, sharp. Another loaded his weapon without command. Outside, the wind shifted east, carrying the first faint hum of engines, a sound that would soon merge into the roar of an armada. By 4:30, the sky to the west glowed faintly orange. The invasion had begun, though the defenders still didn't know it. By 5 a.m., the horizon no longer resembled sea and sky, but a solid, moving wall of steel. Through the mist and rain, the first outlines of the Allied fleet appeared. Thousands of ships and landing craft stretching as far as the eye could see. For the men of the 352nd Infantry Division, stationed above Omaha Beach, the sight was beyond comprehension. Many had believed the invasion, if it ever came, would target Calais. What now approached them seemed to defy numbers, logic, and belief. The German coastal artillery opened fire first. From Pointe du Hoc to Vierzeville-sur-Mer, 155mm and 88mm guns began to thunder, their shells arcing across the channel. The return fire came almost instantly. Allied battleships and cruisers unleashed salvos that shattered the calm. Each impact threw sand and steel into the air, shaking bunkers as though the earth itself were being split apart. Power lines snapped. Telephones went dead. Within minutes, the entire command chain was reduced to isolated pockets of resistance. At 5:45, the bombardment intensified. Every fortified position along the beach fell under the combined weight of naval shells, rockets, and aerial bombs. The defenders inside the bunkers endured the strikes in silence. Concrete cracked, dust filled the air, and gun barrels glowed from the heat. The entire Atlantic Wall, the structure that propaganda had called invincible, now revealed its vulnerability. It could withstand an attack. It could not withstand annihilation from the sea and sky at once. At 6:30, the sound of engines drowned out the guns. The first landing craft reached the surf. American troops of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions poured into the water, struggling through the waves under fire. The German machine guns opened up, cutting through the first ranks. The defenders' firing fields, mapped months earlier, were brutally efficient. Every yard of beach was measured, every obstacle pre-sighted. For the first half hour, the invasion hung on the edge of disaster. Yet the German advantage was temporary. Communications between strong points were gone. Ammunition stocks were running low. The defenders fired blindly into smoke and fog, unaware that their flanking positions had already been silenced by naval gunfire. The bunkers that survived the bombardment became tombs. Direct hits from battleship shells collapsed ceilings and sealed exits. Those who escaped crawled through trenches half filled with debris, moving toward whatever firing post still answered back. By 8 a.m., American troops were breaking through in scattered groups. Engineers cleared mines. Riflemen advanced behind tanks that barely made it ashore. The German system, so dependent on cohesion, could not adapt to chaos. Individual courage replaced coordination, and isolated squads fought to the last round. Inland, German reserves struggled to move forward. Allied aircraft controlled the skies, strafing every road. What the men on the beaches didn't know was that their reinforcements would never reach them in time. The Atlantic Wall, designed to delay the enemy long enough for counterattack, was doing just that, delaying, but the counterattack would never come. Inside the ruins of one bunker, the letter still lay inside its field pouch, covered in dust and concrete powder. The sea outside roared like thunder, and the promise written the night before, that the sea would reveal its truth, had come to pass. By mid-morning, the battle for Omaha Beach had turned into a struggle of endurance. The German 352nd Infantry Division, once numbering over 7,000 men, was rapidly fragmenting into disconnected groups. The terrain that had been carefully mapped for defense, dunes, ridges, and trenches, now worked against them. Smoke and debris obscured sightlines, and craters filled with water became graves. The machine gunners who had inflicted such devastating losses at dawn were now nearly out of ammunition. Their resupply routes had been obliterated by shellfire. Radios were silent, telephone wires shredded. Orders no longer came from command. Survival itself had become the only directive. From their vantage points above the beach, German soldiers could see what no propaganda had ever prepared them for: the scale of Allied logistics. Landing craft returned again and again, bringing more men, more tanks, more supplies. Every time a position was cleared by fire, new waves filled the beach. The rhythm of war had shifted. The German defense system, built on precision and efficiency, was facing an enemy built on momentum and abundance. At 9:30, American units began to organize their advance. Infantry pushed inland under the cover of naval artillery, while engineers detonated gaps through the beach obstacles. The tide of the invasion turned, not through heroism alone, but through adaptation. The Allies learned faster than the defenders could react. On the German side, confusion deepened. Some strong points continued to fight, unaware that others had already been overrun. Others surrendered when surrounded, their bunkers choked with smoke and blood. A handful of isolated artillery batteries continued firing blindly until they were silenced by naval gunfire or airstrikes. Reports trickled back to divisional headquarters near St. Lo, each one worse than the last. The front line was disintegrating, counterattacks were impossible, fuel shortages left tanks stranded, and attempts to regroup units failed as Allied aircraft swept low over every open road. The defensive system that had taken years to construct was collapsing in hours. By midday, the Germans no longer controlled the coastline. American units were advancing beyond the bluffs, cutting through the hedgerows that would soon define the brutal fighting to come. The defenders who survived the bombardment faced capture or death. Entire companies ceased to exist, their names recorded only in morning reports that would never reach higher command. In one of the destroyed bunkers near Colleville, a squad of engineers discovered remnants of burned papers among scattered equipment. Among them was a sealed envelope marked simply, "For my wife." The letter inside was mostly intact, though the edges were singed. Its words were dated June 5th, written in the stillness before the storm. For the Allies who found it, it was a small, human trace in the wreckage of a machine that had finally broken. By evening, Omaha Beach was secured. The cost was enormous. Over 2,000 American casualties, hundreds of German dead, and an entire division shattered. Yet the system that had defined Nazi Europe, control, obedience, order, had failed in its purest form. Against a coordinated, flexible enemy, it could not adapt fast enough to survive. The soldiers' words written the night before were now a fragment of history, a final reflection of calm before a world ended. By the night of June 6th, the guns had quieted over Omaha Beach. Smoke drifted inland, carried by the same wind that had once blown across empty sand. The Atlantic wall was no longer a barrier, but a graveyard, a strip of coastline littered with wrecked bunkers, broken weapons, and the remnants of an army that had believed itself invincible. Inland, what remained of the 352nd Infantry Division tried to regroup. Pockets of resistance held villages and crossroads, fighting until ammunition ran dry. Some units, cut off entirely, melted into the countryside. Others dug in around Saint-Lô and Trèves, determined to delay the Allied advance. But the truth was already clear. The German defense in Normandy had failed its first and most crucial test. The reason was not lack of courage. The defenders had fought with determination, holding out for hours against impossible odds. The failure came from the system above them, a structure built for control, not flexibility. Orders could not travel faster than confusion. Authority was concentrated so tightly that when communications failed, the entire machine froze. Hitler's insistence that no armored division move without his direct permission left crucial reserves immobilized while the beaches burned. At 2300 hours on June 6, after most of the fighting had ended, scattered German survivors gathered along the ridgelines overlooking the beach. They watched the Allies build what looked like a city of ships. Supply vessels, bulldozers, tanks, cranes, an entire war machine assembling itself in real time. One officer reportedly said, "This is not an army. It is an industry." By dawn, engineers had begun clearing routes inland. American convoys moved ashore, establishing depots and command posts. The logistical superiority that had defined the Allies throughout the war was now visible in its purest form. The Germans, exhausted and isolated, were facing not just soldiers, but the full weight of an industrial civilization mobilized for war. In Berlin, the High Command received conflicting reports. Some claimed the invasion was only a diversion. Others confirmed massive troop landings across Normandy. Hitler ordered the Panzer reserves to move north, but the delay had already cost an entire day. The German response, cautious, delayed, fragmented, mirrored the paralysis of its defensive structure. Among the ruins of Colville, an Allied officer tasked with mapping the beach defenses found the letter recovered from the bunker. It was translated and sent to headquarters for documentation. Its tone stood out, calm, reflective, without ideology. It spoke not of victory or sacrifice, but of routine and resignation. The simple observation that "the sea will tell us first" captured the quiet inevitability of what had happened. For the Allies, the letter became an artifact of perspective, evidence that even those inside the fortress sensed its fragility. For the Germans, had any of them survived to read it, it would have been a final acknowledgement that their war was no longer being fought by men, but by systems too vast for any one soldier to influence. By June 7th, the beaches of Normandy were secure, and the first Allied airfields were already under construction. The war had entered a new phase. For one side, it was the beginning of liberation. For the other, it was the slow realization that their defeat had already been written. Not in orders or strategy, but in the silence before the invasion began. June 7th brought a new kind of silence to Normandy. Not peace, but the pause between destruction and pursuit. The sea was calmer now, though still choked with wreckage. Dead men and machines drifted in the surf. The Allies worked methodically, turning chaos into structure. Bulldozers cleared beachheads, engineers laid track and cables, and cranes lifted crates from ships to shore. Within 24 hours, an entire logistical base had emerged where bunkers once stood. For the surviving German defenders, this transformation was surreal. The positions that had taken years to fortify were now being dismantled in days. Those who had escaped capture retreated toward Saint-Lô and Bayeux, carrying little more than rifles and disbelief. Their reports spoke of overwhelming numbers, ceaseless artillery, and skies that belonged entirely to the enemy. It was the end of an era, the moment when German tactical excellence met the immovable reality of Allied production. The 352nd Infantry Division no longer existed as a coherent force. Its commander, General Kreis, tried to regroup what remained, but his communications were gone, his supply lines cut. The division that had once been held as one of the best defensive units in France was now a shadow scattered across the countryside. In the fields behind Omaha, small groups of soldiers dug shallow trenches or hid among hedgerows, waiting for orders that would never come. The letter found among the ruins of the Colleville bunker was brought inland by an American intelligence officer assigned to document German defenses. It joined hundreds of other artifacts collected in those first days: maps, diaries, fragments of field orders, the paper remnants of a defeated system. What made this letter different was its tone. It contained no hatred, no propaganda, no expression of glory. It was quiet, even fatalistic. In those few lines, it reflected the exhaustion of a soldier who sensed that the war had already turned against him, long before the first landing craft appeared. By June 8th, German counterattacks began, desperate, disorganized, and easily broken. The Panzer Lehr Division, moving from Le Mans, lost dozens of tanks to Allied airstrikes before even reaching the front. Every attempt to mass forces was cut apart from above. The German command structure, built to execute perfect plans, was now reacting to a battle it could no longer control. Meanwhile, the Allies continued to expand their foothold. By nightfall, American and British troops were linked along the Norman coast. The logistics of victory had begun. Thousands of tons of supplies flowed ashore daily, carried by men who had never fired a shot, but were just as vital as those who did. The difference between systems was now visible in every crate, every repaired bridge, every reloaded gun. In Berlin, Hitler raged at reports from the Western Front, blaming generals for cowardice and delay. He refused to authorize strategic withdrawals, insisting that the Atlantic Wall still stood in principle, even if it no longer existed in fact. The disconnect between ideology and reality had become absolute. And somewhere within that vast machinery, between the ruined bunkers of Normandy and the unreachable commands of Berlin, the words of one unknown soldier survived, a single calm voice amid the collapse of an empire built on noise. By June 9th, the battle for Normandy had shifted inland. The beaches that had been killing grounds only 3 days earlier were now supply depots and medical stations. Rows of vehicles stretched to the horizon. The Allies had turned the impossible into procedure. Where the Germans saw chaos, the Americans and British saw systems, logistics as weaponry. German counterattacks continued, but without coordination or air support, they achieved little. The 21st Panzer Division, rushed from Caen, tried to strike between British and Canadian forces, but was driven back within hours. Further west, remnants of the 352nd Infantry Division attempted to regroup near Trevière, only to be shattered again by naval bombardment. The once structured German defense was dissolving into local skirmishes. Inside what remained of the Atlantic Wall, the true weakness of the system became clear. It was never designed to be dynamic. Every order had to travel upward before coming down again, a fatal delay in a war now defined by speed. The men trapped inside bunkers and trenches had fought according to a doctrine that no longer applied, one where obedience mattered more than initiative. When that doctrine broke, it left them directionless. Allied soldiers moving inland found evidence of this paralysis everywhere. Half-finished orders, unread messages, radios still tuned to silent frequencies. The German army, once considered the most disciplined in the world, was now a machine running without power. In the ruins of the Colleville sector, war correspondents accompanied engineers documenting the aftermath. They photographed destroyed guns, shattered casemates, and the twisted wreckage of coastal defenses. Among these, the letter discovered days earlier was shown to one of them. He described it as strangely peaceful, words written in the shadow of certainty. It would later be translated and archived in London, alongside thousands of other recovered documents from Normandy. The letter's significance lay not in its content, but in its timing. It captured the last moment of calm before the European war reached its irreversible turning point. On June 5th, Germany still controlled most of Western Europe. By June 9th, that control was fracturing under the combined force of industrial, technological, and organizational superiority. Back in Germany, news from the front was fragmented. State radio continued to broadcast claims of success, the invasion repelled, the beaches secured, even as reports from the field painted a different picture. Hitler, convinced the main landing was still to come at Calais, refused to shift reinforcements to Normandy. The system that demanded absolute obedience was now destroying itself through it. By June 10th, Allied lines stretched several miles inland. German artillery, low on ammunition, fired sporadically. The Luftwaffe was almost absent from the skies. The Atlantic Wall, once an emblem of German control, had become a silent monument to misplaced confidence. And beneath that silence, scattered across the ruins of Normandy, letters like the one from Colleville lay buried in sand and ash. Words from men who had stood at the edge of history and sensed even before dawn that it was already slipping away. By June 11th, the reality of the invasion was undeniable. The Allies had landed over 325,000 troops, 50,000 vehicles, and more than 100,000 tons of supplies. The beaches that German commanders had called indefensible were now functioning ports, connected by roads, fuel lines, and radio networks. The once impenetrable Atlantic Wall had become a logistical artery for the very enemy it was meant to destroy. German resistance persisted, but it was now fragmented into defensive pockets. The remnants of the 352nd Infantry Division fought around St. Lo, reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Survivors described fighting not as organized defense, but as survival, ambushing convoys, retreating through hedgerows, then being encircled again. Without coordination, they fought in the dark, unaware of the scale of what surrounded them. Everywhere, the contrast between two systems became clearer. The German army still fought with individual skill, but the Allies fought with process. Supply, communication, repair, all functioned as one organism. Allied soldiers could lose a position and retake it within hours. German units, once cut off, could never recover. The difference between adaptation and rigidity was becoming the defining factor of the war. Captured officers questioned by Allied intelligence often mentioned the same frustration, the inability to act without orders. One commander, interviewed weeks later, said simply, "We waited too long for permission to save ourselves." That single sentence summed up the paralysis of an entire institution. The structure that had given the German military its precision in 1940 now made it incapable of flexibility in 1944. On the coast, the process of reconstruction continued relentlessly. Engineers dismantled the remaining German fortifications, clearing them for supply dumps or field hospitals. In the ruins of one casemate, a British officer found a burnt notebook with fragments of poetry written in German, perhaps from the same soldier who had written the letter days earlier. The pages were scorched, the ink blurred, but a single line remained legible. "We are not waiting for death, but for history to move through us." By now, Allied intelligence had fully analyzed captured documents and plans detailing the Atlantic Wall's construction. What they found mirrored what the soldiers on the ground already knew, that the defensive system had been formidable in appearance, but weak in adaptability. Overconfidence, centralized control, and resource shortages had turned an engineering marvel into a static monument. The story of that failure was unfolding across Europe. The same rigidity that had doomed the defenses in Normandy was visible everywhere in the German war effort, in the collapsing Eastern Front, in the ruined cities of the Reich, and in the inflexible chain of command that refused to acknowledge reality until it was too late. By mid-June, Allied forces had linked all 5 beachheads into a continuous front. The invasion had succeeded not only through courage or surprise, but through the culmination of planning that had turned modern warfare into a system of logistics, timing, and precision. In the archives where the Colleville letter would eventually rest, historians later noted its tone was prophetic. It was not written in despair, but in quiet understanding. A reflection of one man who sensed that the sea before him was not only a barrier, but a mirror, reflecting the fate of an empire that could no longer change its course. By June 15th, the German command finally understood that Normandy, not Calais, was the main front. But the realization came too late. Every mile of coastline lost in those first days had given the Allies what they needed most: time. Time to bring in reinforcements, armor, fuel, and ammunition on a scale no European army had ever seen. The bridgehead was no longer a beach, it was a continent in miniature. The German counteroffensive attempts began with desperation, not confidence. Elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Götz von Berlichingen, moved toward Carentan, where paratroopers of the 101st Airborne had established a fragile link between Utah and Omaha beaches. The fighting was intense, close, and personal, but it was also futile. Allied artillery and air power responded within minutes to every movement, guided by spotters and radar. German units found themselves destroyed before they could even form a line. For the German soldiers who had survived Omaha, the war no longer made sense. They had done what they were trained to do: defend, obey, endure. But the structure that demanded obedience could no longer protect them. Orders came too slowly, and when they did, they belonged to a different battlefield. The Wehrmacht's communications, so advanced in 1940, were now obsolete under constant bombardment and electronic interference. The once coordinated army of the Blitzkrieg era was fighting blind. Back in Berlin, Hitler's headquarters received daily reports, each one diluted to preserve morale. Generals who spoke frankly were removed or ignored. The Führer insisted the situation in Normandy was under control and that new miracle weapons would turn the tide. Those at the front knew better. They had already seen the tide turn, in the literal sense, on June 6th. Nothing could reverse it now. The Allies advanced slowly but deliberately, consolidating every gain. Each captured village became a supply hub, each road a new artery of war. The German resistance was fierce, but it lacked depth. When one position fell, the next had no time to prepare. Every German counterattack cost irreplaceable fuel, ammunition, and men. The system that had once thrived on mobility was now trapped in place by its own rigidity. In the ruins of Colville, Allied engineers continued to catalog captured materials. The soldier's letter, recovered intact, was sent to London for translation and analysis. It was filed among thousands of documents under the label Enemy Personal Correspondence, Normandy Sector. Those who read it were struck by its simplicity. There were no slogans, no hatred, only a quiet recognition that something immense was coming, something beyond any soldier's control. As the Allies pushed towards Saint-Lô and Caen, the human dimension of the German collapse became more visible. Prisoners spoke of confusion, of endless waiting, of orders that never came. Many said they had known the invasion was inevitable, but had hoped to survive it by luck, not belief. The romanticism of sacrifice that had fueled earlier years of the war had vanished, replaced by exhaustion and fatalism. By June 20th, the Allied bridgehead in Normandy had become unbreakable. The front stretched from Cherbourg to Caen, and every day thousands more men landed on French soil. The war that Hitler had promised would never reach Germany's western heartland was now advancing toward it step by step. The letter from the Colleville bunker, written with calm precision the night before the invasion, now stood as the perfect contrast to the chaos that followed. It captured a truth that the German command had never accepted, that wars are not lost in a single day, but in the years before, when systems mistake control for strength and obedience for victory. By late June 1944, the Normandy front had solidified into a brutal, grinding campaign. The Allies had secured their foothold. Germany's chance to push them back had vanished. The beaches that had once been symbols of defense now served as arteries of invasion. Endless columns of vehicles rolled inland. The noise of engines replaced the roar of guns, and with each passing day, the Allies built what the Germans could no longer destroy: momentum. The surviving fragments of the 352nd Infantry Division fought on around Saint-Lô. Cut off from supply, low on food and ammunition, they held their positions with grim determination. But even courage could not sustain them against air superiority and overwhelming firepower. Each time they regrouped, Allied bombers tore the ground apart again. Villages disappeared beneath dust and flame. The defenders fought not for victory anymore, but for hours in delaying what they knew could not be stopped. By early July, the German defensive network in Normandy had become a memory. Bunkers that once faced the sea now faced inland, surrounded by Allied troops. The Atlantic Wall, once the pride of Hitler's propaganda, had collapsed under the weight of its contradictions. It had been a wall of concrete, but not of understanding. Built for static defense in a world that demanded mobility, it symbolized the very flaw that doomed the Reich: faith in structure over adaptability. The letter from the Colleville bunker was sent from London to Washington, where it was translated and archived among the captured German records. It remained anonymous, its author identified only by rank and regiment. Yet its words carried something rare: the absence of illusion. "The sea feels different tonight," he had written. "It has a strange calm." Those lines outlasted the war, preserved not as propaganda, but as testimony, a human voice beneath the machinery of history. In the years that followed, historians and archivists would return to that letter, not for sentiment, but for clarity. It revealed a soldier aware of the inevitability around him, trapped in a system that no longer matched the reality it faced. He did not see the invasion coming in strategic terms. He simply sensed change. That quiet intuition made his words more truthful than any military report written that night. By August, Paris would be liberated. Within a year, the Reich itself would fall. But the story of D-Day was more than an invasion. It was a collision between two philosophies of war. On one side, a rigid structure built on obedience, precision, and command. On the other, a flexible system powered by cooperation, logistics, and adaptation. The letter from Omaha's shore, though personal, reflected that divide perfectly. one man's stillness before the arrival of something greater than himself. When the war ended, the Colleville bunker became part of a memorial overlooking the beach. The sea below, once filled with fire, returned to quiet rhythm. Visitors rarely know that somewhere within the archives, the words of a German soldier still exist. Written the night before the invasion, untouched by ideology, describing only the weather, the sea, and a feeling that history was about to move. In that sense, he was right. The sea did change. It carried not just ships and men, but the turning of the entire war. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.